happened in July of last year, during what was supposed to be a simple few days away from home. My house was having major electrical issues, and the repairs left me without power for several days. Since I work from home, that was a huge problem. After checking my options, I decided to rent an Airbnb just to get my work done and keep my life moving forward. Unfortunately, I don't live in the biggest city, so Airbnb choices near me were pretty limited. I ended up finding one that was about a 45-minute drive from my house. The area wasn't great, kind of run down and isolated, but the price was right and I was only staying for a few days. I figured I could deal with it. When I arrived, it was already late. I barely took a look around before heading straight to bed. The stress of dealing with my house had left me exhausted and I just wanted to sleep it off. The next morning, I woke up early and set up my laptop and workspace, ready to dive into the mountain of work I had to catch up on. It was quiet, just the sound of the wind outside and the occasional car passing. But just as I was about to start my first meeting, there was a sudden knock at the door. I hesitated. I wasn't expecting anyone. It wasn't even my house, so the idea of opening the door felt wrong. But then I thought it might be the host, maybe coming to check in on something. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. Standing on the porch was a man, probably in his early 30s, covered in tattoos and definitely not looking like an Airbnb host. His appearance caught me off guard. He wasn't dressed like a salesperson or delivery guy either. His clothes were scruffy, and something about the way he stood there, staring blankly at the door, made my stomach tighten. I stepped away from the door, deciding not to open it. I didn't owe this guy anything. Instead, I went back to my desk, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. I had a long workday ahead and didn't want to get distracted. Hours passed and I didn't hear anything else. I was buried in my work, from meetings to catching up on the time I'd lost dealing with my house's power problems. It wasn't until 8 p.m. that I finally stepped away from my desk to grab a quick dinner. I was starting to feel normal again, relaxed even, until there was another knock at the door. My heart sank. I went to check and sure enough, it was the same guy as before, standing in the exact same spot. But this time, it was late. What could he possibly want from me now? My nerves kicked into overdrive. I was more annoyed than scared at first, wondering if he was just some weird local bothering the Airbnb renters. I wasn't going to answer, so I walked away from the door, trying to convince myself that he would just leave. After about 30 minutes, I returned to work for a little while, putting in another hour before finally closing my laptop for the night. I hadn't realized how late it had gotten or how dark the house was, with only the soft glow from my laptop lighting the room. As I got up to turn on the lights, I froze. On the floor, leading from the front door and through the hallway, were wet shoe prints. My heart raced as my eyes followed the trail. It wound through the house, circling the desk where I had been working, and headed toward the back door, which was now slightly ajar. A chill crawled down my spine. Someone had been inside. Someone had walked through the house while I was sitting at my desk, completely unaware. I was paralyzed with fear, but before I could even process what to do next, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the staircase behind me. They were careful, almost like whoever it was didn't want to be heard. I stood there, rooted to the spot as the footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. A man appeared in the hallway, and it was him, the same tattooed guy from the porch. His face was twisted in surprise, like he wasn't expecting to see me standing there. But that surprise quickly turned into rage. His eyes narrowed, and his expression became one of pure, simmering anger. In that moment, I knew I had to get out of there. My instincts took over, and I bolted for the back door, flinging it open and sprinting out into the night. I didn't stop running, tearing through the backyard and into the dense trees beyond the house. I could hear footsteps behind me, pounding across the wet grass. I ducked behind a tree, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. My phone was in my hand, but when I went to dial 911, I hesitated. The footsteps were getting closer. I held my breath, praying that he wouldn't find me. The sound of running slowed as the man passed by, his heavy footsteps fading into the darkness. I waited until I couldn't hear him anymore before I finally called for help. The police arrived not long after, and I told them everything. The knocks, the footprints, the man inside the house. They searched the area and found no sign of him at first. But the next day, they caught him. He matched the description I gave them, right down to the tattoos. It turns out he had been breaking into homes in the area for weeks, doing unspeakable things to the people living inside. I don't know why he left me alone the first time or why he waited until that night to make his move, but I'm grateful I got out when I did. I'm still haunted by the thought of what might have happened if I hadn't noticed the footprints, or if I hadn't run fast enough. That man had every intention of hurting me, and I'll never forget the look in his eyes as he stared me down in that hallway. I've been on plenty of road trips before, but what happened to me last year still haunts me. I was driving cross-country for work, headed to Maine to wrap up some business at a remote office. But since I was already on the road, I decided to make it a multi-stop trip to visit some friends and family along the East Coast. By the time I hit day 4 of my drive, I found myself deep in rural Pennsylvania, cutting through winding back roads and endless highways. The area was remote, just stretches of dense forest, foggy valleys, and the occasional small town. The sun had already set, and a steady rain was coming down, making visibility worse with each passing mile. And as luck would have it, my gas tank was nearly empty. I hadn't seen a gas station for over an hour, and was starting to get anxious. Just as my fuel gauge hit the red, I spotted a faint sign through the thickening fog gas station, 2 miles ahead. I sighed in relief and slowed down, keeping an eye out for the turn. A few minutes later I saw it, a small, rundown gas station off to the right, almost swallowed by the surrounding trees. The building looked weathered and the entire place was eerily dark except for a dim light coming from inside. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts screaming that something was off, but I had no choice. I pulled in slowly, feeling the tires crunch over the gravel, and parked next to one of the 2 ancient pumps. Everything about this place looked frozen in time, like it hadn't been used in decades, but I was desperate for gas. I got out of the car, immediately soaked by the rain, and made my way to the pump. I tried swiping my card, but the dusty screen stayed blank. Confused, I wiped it down, hoping to see some kind of display. Nothing. I moved to the other pump, but it was the same. Dead. Frustrated and now a little on edge, I looked around. The only light I could see was coming from inside the concession building behind the pumps. It was just a faint, warm glow, completely out of place in such a dark, abandoned location. Maybe it's a worker, I thought. Maybe they could help. So, I made my way through the rain to the building. The glass door was covered in a thick layer of moisture, making it impossible to see inside. I wiped the fog away, squinting through the dim light. I could just make out empty shelves and scattered debris inside. Something about it made my stomach twist. I pulled the door handle, and with a loud metallic screech, it opened. The inside was worse than I imagined. The shelves were not just empty, they were toppled over. Broken glass and garbage littered the floor, and the walls were lined with strange, faded graffiti. The whole place looked ransacked, like someone or something had torn through it in a frenzy. The only source of light was coming from a small lamp on the counter, flickering weakly. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This place was wrong. Really wrong. I didn't know what was going on, but I sure as hell wasn't going to stick around to find out. I stepped back, heading for the door. As I backed out into the rain, I glanced back at my car, and my heart stopped. There was a figure standing next to it. A person, completely drenched, was leaning against my car, peering through the windows. They were wearing a heavy dark coat with the hood pulled up so I couldn't see their face. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get back in my car, but I was too shocked to move. "Hey, what are you doing?" I yelled over the rain. They turned slowly to face me, but instead of answering, their gaze shifted behind me, toward the building. I turned and my blood ran cold. A man had just stepped out of the gas station. He looked sickly, with long, tangled black hair and pale, hollow eyes that seemed to shine in the darkness. He was soaking wet, his clothes clinging to his gaunt frame. But what scared me the most was the way he looked at me, like a predator sizing up prey. Then, without warning, he bolted toward me. Panic surged through me. I turned and sprinted back to my car, adrenaline pounding in my ears. The figure that had been standing next to my car just stepped back, watching silently as I yanked the door open and threw myself inside. I barely managed to lock the doors before the man slammed into the side of the car, his face twisted in rage. He yanked at the handle, screaming, and I realized he was holding something, a rusty metal rod, scraping it down the side of the car with a horrible screech. I floored the gas, tires spinning in the mud as I lurched back onto the road. The man ran after me, his shouts echoing through the rain. My hand shook as I gripped the wheel, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, praying he wouldn't follow me. After about 30 minutes of driving, my car sputtered and finally ran out of gas. I coasted to a stop on the side of the road, panting and drenched in sweat despite the cold. I quickly checked my phone, and by some miracle I had cell service. I dialed 911 and waited for help, my heart still racing. The police arrived not long after, and I told them everything, the dead pumps, the lamp, the man chasing me. But when I showed them where it happened, they exchanged uneasy glances. "Sir," one of the officers said, "that gas station has been abandoned for over a decade. There hasn't been power there in years." I felt a chill run through me, but it got worse. They took a look at my car. The metal rod had left a long, jagged scratch down the entire length of the door, but the officer pointed out something else, something I hadn't noticed. Burn marks around the edges of the scratch, like whatever that man was holding was scorching hot. To this day, I don't know who or what I encountered that night. Was it just some crazed squatter, or was it something else, something that shouldn't exist? I'm just glad I got out of there when I did. If I'd hesitated for even a second longer, I might not be here to tell this story. About 10 months ago, I had an experience that still sends chills down my spine whenever I think about it. It all started when I decided to spend a few days with my best friend from college, who I'll call Chris for privacy. We hadn't seen each other in a while, and since we used to be pretty adventurous during our college years, this trip was long overdue. Chris lived in a small, quiet town, a complete contrast to what I was used to. It was one of those places where everyone knew each other, and you could feel the stillness in the air. We spent the first couple of days just relaxing, hitting a few bars, hanging out, reminiscing about old times, and just enjoying each other's company. But on my last night there, Chris mentioned something that piqued my interest. He had been wanting to check out this abandoned place out in the woods for a while, but he hadn't had anyone to go with. It wasn't just a house, it was a small abandoned town or settlement a few miles deep in the forest. Now, if you knew us from college, you'd know that we were always down for exploring and adventure. This sounded right up our alley. Within 30 minutes, we had our gear ready and were already trekking down a trail leading into the woods. We still had some daylight left, but we brought headlamps just in case it got dark before we made it back. The trail was well worn at first, but as we went deeper into the woods, the path became faint, almost like no one had walked it in years. Branches snapped underfoot, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves around us. It took another hour of walking through the dense forest before we finally reached it. At first, we could only see a single house in the distance, partially hidden by trees. But as we got closer, more houses came into view, several of them lined up like a forgotten neighborhood. But what struck us as strange was that these houses didn't look that old. Sure, they were damaged and overgrown with weeds, but they weren't ancient ruins. They had modern siding and features that made them look like any ordinary homes that could be found in any small town. There was even a tiny gravel road leading from one house to the next. It was as if they had been building a community here, and for some unknown reason, it was all just abandoned. Other people had clearly been here before us. Graffiti covered some of the walls, and it was clear that curious explorers had left their marks. But what really grabbed our attention was the silence. No animals, no wind, just an eerie, empty quiet. We approached the first house. Its door was wide open, and inside we could see weeds growing up through the floorboards. The house was empty, but oddly, it felt like it had only recently been left behind. Before we could step inside, though, we were startled by a loud slamming sound echoing through the woods. Chris and I both froze, looking toward the source of the noise. It had come from down the gravel road, but when we stared down the path, there was nothing. Just the same silent, empty woods. We exchanged uneasy glances, but curiosity got the better of us. After not seeing anything, we decided to continue. We stepped into the first house, walking slowly through the rooms. There wasn't much to see, a few scattered pieces of broken furniture, dirt, and overgrown plants. But what fascinated us was trying to figure out why anyone would abandon a place like this. It didn't make sense. The houses were relatively modern, and it seemed like they had been built to be lived in. After exploring the first floor, we moved upstairs. That's when things started to feel wrong. The upstairs was incredibly dark, way darker than it should have been. There were no windows letting in light, and the air felt heavy. There were only 2 doors at the end of the short hallway, with a small attic door in the ceiling above. We cautiously opened the first door, revealing another empty room, but before we could explore further, we heard something that stopped us dead in our tracks. Footsteps. They were coming from outside, through the grass, heading toward the house we were in. We stood still, barely breathing. Whoever it was, they had seen us outside, but why would anyone approach us? We hadn't seen a soul out here. The footsteps grew closer until they reached the front doorway, and then, they stopped. Chris and I exchanged panicked glances. Then we heard a voice. Hello? It was a man's voice, rough and uneven, like he was slurring his words. He sounded older, almost like he was missing teeth or had trouble speaking clearly. I just want to talk. No harm at all. We didn't respond, we just stood there, frozen. The man didn't say anything else, and for the next minute there was only silence. We didn't hear him leave. He was still there. But why wasn't he moving? What did he want? After waiting for what felt like an eternity, Chris quietly made his way down the stairs, trying to get a look at the front door. When he reached the bottom, he turned back to me, his face completely pale. There's nobody there, he whispered. I quickly followed him down and looked for myself. He wasn't lying. The doorway was empty, but I could still feel the presence of someone watching us. We stepped cautiously toward the entrance, our hearts pounding. That's when we noticed something chilling. There was a single line of footprints in the grass leading up to the house, but no footprints leading away. We both realized it at the same time. Whoever this man was, he was still nearby, hiding somewhere inside the house. That was enough for us. Without a second thought, we bolted out of the house and into the woods, running faster than I thought was possible. We didn't stop until we were back at Chris's place, our lungs burning, our hearts racing. We never looked back. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or what he wanted with us. All I know is that if he had found us in that house, I might not be here to tell this story.